closeness and tenderness blossom with a little help from Brahms, where the melody to I Love You Oh So Much is taken from his Third Symphony. I love you oh so much, how I thrill to your touch, and the way your eyes meet mine tells me you feel that way too. Oh, your light shines so bright, and your essence fills the night. How your image holds me so, never letting me go. All the days of my life seem to pass wanting you for my wife. Now I ask you, my heart beating fast, come away with me, stay with me, love me long at last. This last song I sang, I Love You Oh So Much, to me was motivated by years ago. I heard a song called the Anniversary Song, and I felt that this had the same type of emotion to it and feeling. And it did remind me of how deep love can go in so many different ways. The story that I want to tell you now is about a situation that I saw once again in Montpellier, France. There was a country farmer who came into the hospital with his wife. His wife, as it turned out, had the worst type of malignant brain tumor you can have, called a glioblastoma multiforme. Again, in those days, we didn't have any MRIs or CAT scans, but we did have the angiogram. I performed the angiogram and showed this just mass of abnormal blood vessels going where they weren't supposed to go, but were very indicative of this particular type of tumor. One of my tasks, whenever we had a brain tumor, or even a spinal cord tumor, was that at night, after the major work was done during the day, I had to make a schema, or a cartoon representative of the distribution of the blood vessels, and then fill in the anatomy of the brain that was distorted to the best of my ability. And then we would compare it at surgery with Professor Gross showing me where I was correct or where I had exaggerated. Anyway, I was in the process of doing this exercise when there was a knock on the door, and I let a gentleman in. It happened to be the lady's husband, and he comes in and kind of threateningly puts me up against the wall and says, "Are you Dr. Stopak?" And I said, "Yes, I am." "Why?" He said, "Are you operating on my wife tomorrow morning?" And I said, "Yes, I am." "Why?" He said, "Well, I want to know what you're doing." I said, "Well, we're doing a major operation on her brain." He says, "You're doing a major operation on the brain? What does that mean?" And so he started saying, "Talk to me like a man. Talk to me like a man." I said, "Well, I think your wife has a brain tumor, and we have to find out exactly what it is so we can treat it properly." He says, "A brain tumor? Talk to me like a man. What does that mean? What kind of brain tumors are they?" So then I explained that there are benign brain tumors or malignant brain tumors or something somewhere in between. So he says, "Fine, now you're talking to me like a man. That's what I want to hear. That's what I want to hear." And I thought he was kind of crazy at first. Well, as it turns out, he keeps quizzing me. "Now, what's this operation all about? What are you going to do to her?" I said, "Well, we're going to put her to sleep, and then we have to open up her head to get to her brain." And he says, "So what can happen in this operation?" I said, well, these are very serious operations. He says, that's not good enough. You're not talking to me like a man. Talk to me like a man. So now I'm kind of warming up to the topic, and he still is being very threatening to me, standing not very far away and pushing me against the wall. I said, well, it's a very serious operation. Of course, she could die from the operation. So then he says, well, now you're talking to me like a man. That's what I want to hear. So I really thought he was a little off his kilter here. But then I warm up to the topic. He said, what else can happen if she doesn't die? I said, well, she could be paralyzed, or she could lose her speech or her balance, or any number of things can happen to her. And each time I gave a sequence of what could possibly happen with the surgery, he would come up with, that's what I want to hear. Now you're talking to me like a man. And when he left the office that night, I really thought he was kind of a screwball. Well, the next day we operated on his wife, and we resected this tumor as best we could, by the way, which hasn't been a whole lot of progress from 1969 to the present with this particular type of tumor with its prognosis, although there is some minor improvements. But anyway, she did survive the operation, and she survived with no obvious neurological deficits. And the next day, I realized what was happening. The next day I went into the intensive care unit, and I saw that he was having coffee and croissant with his wife. And they were exchanging loving sentiments to each other in a most gentle, tender way. And I understood what was going on. He was preparing himself to what could happen to his wife. So there's a phrase about always expect the unexpected, and that's what he was doing. As it turned out, she did fine for the number of months that was left for her, but he was perfectly happy to know what could happen to his wife, what she had, what the prognosis was, and for those moments. I think it's the best lesson perhaps that I've ever learned in my neurosurgical experience, and that I've always been and tried to be as clear and precise and direct with my patients in a compassionate manner to help them get through all these different crises that people face. This next story doesn't involve love so much as it does pure, unadulterated luck. This is a story about a 40-year-old Midwestern traveling salesman who was in Washington, D.C. He had sought the attention of a prostitute on the streets in downtown Washington. She led him up to a rooming house, to a room there. And upon entering the room, she had an accomplice who promptly shot him in the head. So he and then stole all his valuables. Well, somebody in the little hotel there heard the shot, called the ambulance, and brought him into the emergency room at George Washington Hospital. When I came down to see him, I see this man who's lying on the stretcher, on his back, and he's wide awake, saying, "Am I alive or am I dead? Am I alive or am I dead? Am I alive or am I dead?" So I examined him, and sure enough, on the left temple above his ear, there was a bullet entrance wound, and on the right temporal area, there was a larger bullet exit wound. And apparently, he was shot in the head with a .22 low caliber pistol. Just to clarify the mechanism of action here, when the .22 caliber bullet entered his scalp, as mentioned, it did strike his skull, but then went in a 180-degree tunnel-like around the back of his head to come out through the other side. The reason you can tell, because entrance wounds for bullets are very small, whereas the exit wounds are much more larger and have ragged edges. So when the bullet penetrated through the scalp, it hit the skull on an angle without damaging it, without causing a fracture, and then skirted underneath something called the galea, which is a structure that is just underneath the scalp, which strips very easily off of the skull. this is how the people in the olden days, when they scalped somebody, this is the layer that they got into. Anyway, we kept him in the hospital for a day or so. There was no internal bleeding or internal problems, and he was discharged uneventfully after a couple of days. So this was not a question of love. It was a question of not love, but luck, as far as I'm concerned.